The sound of Marcus's palm connecting with my cheek echoed through our marble-floored kitchen like a gunshot. For a moment, time suspended itself in that awful silence that follows violence, the kind of quiet where even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to hold its breath. I stood there, my hand instinctively rising to touch the burning skin, tasting blood from where my teeth had cut the inside of my lip. The metallic flavor mixed with something else, something that tasted remarkably like clarity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Look what you made me do, Marcus said, his voice carrying that particular tone of wounded righteousness that bullies perfect after years of practice. He was already shifting into victim mode, the way he always did when his carefully constructed facade cracked. If you hadn't pushed me about the Thompson contract, if you had just listened, but I wasn't listening anymore. Not to his excuses. Not to his justifications, not to the familiar script he'd run whenever his temper got the better of his image. Instead, I was calculating Marcus Richardson, my husband of 6 years, successful corporate lawyer, pillar of the community, and, as of 30 seconds ago, a man who had made the biggest mistake of his life. He just didn't know it yet. You're right, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the throbbing in my jaw. I should have listened. The words seemed to deflate him slightly. Marcus had expected tears, apologies, maybe threats to leave that he could manipulate away with. Flowers and promises. He wasn't prepared for agreement. Sophia, he began, already reaching for the damage control playbook. I should have listened to my instincts 6 months ago, I continued, walking calmly to the kitchen island where my laptop sat open. When I noticed the discrepancies in your client billing. When I saw the deleted emails. When I realized you've been embezzling from your firm for over 2 years. The color drained from Marcus's face faster than wine from a broken glass. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish pulled from water, desperately searching for oxygen that wasn't there. You see, Marcus had made a fundamental error in judgment. He'd assumed that because I worked as a freelance graphic designer from our home, because I deferred to him in social situations, because I let him handle our finances and make the big decisions, that I was naive, helpless, dependent. He'd forgotten that before I met him, I'd worked as a forensic accountant for the FBI. Before I'd fallen in love and decided to build a quieter life. I'd spent 5 years tracking financial crimes, unraveling complex money laundering schemes, and building airtight cases that sent white-collar criminals to federal prison. I'd retired from that life when we married, not because Marcus asked me to, but because I thought I wanted something different. Something peaceful. I'd kept my security clearance active, maintained my professional certifications, told myself it was just in case. I never imagined "in case" would involve my own husband. You don't know what you're talking about, Marcus said, but his voice had lost its authority. The bravado was cracking, revealing the frightened man underneath. I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward him. Client account 47291B. You've been skimming 3% from every settlement, routing it through a shell. Company registered in Delaware. Creative, but sloppy. His eyes widened as he recognized his own financial records, the ones he thought he'd hidden behind encrypted files and password protection. What Marcus didn't understand was that 6 years of marriage had given me ample opportunity to observe his patterns, his passwords, his digital habits. He used the same 4-digit sequence for everything. Our anniversary date. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Matthews settlement, I continued, scrolling through the documents I'd been quietly compiling for months. You reported $2.3 million to the firm, but the actual amount was $2.7 million. The Wilson case, the Henderson bankruptcy, the Morrison divorce. Shall I continue? Marcus sank into one of our bar stools, his expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume that no longer fit. How long have you known? 6 months. Maybe longer, if I'm being honest with myself. I closed the laptop gently, my movements deliberate and controlled. I started noticing things. Late night calls that you said were work emergencies. Trips that didn't match up with your court calendar. That new Rolex you said was a bonus, even though your firm hasn't paid bonuses in 2 years. The kitchen fell silent except for the soft hum of our Sub-Zero refrigerator and Marcus's increasingly labored breathing. I watched him process the magnitude of his situation, saw the exact moment he realized that his carefully constructed world was built on sand, and the tide was coming in. What do you want? He asked finally, his lawyer instincts kicking in. Everything was negotiable in Marcus's world. Every problem had a price, every silence could be bought. I walked to our kitchen window, gazing out at the perfectly manicured garden that our landscaper maintained. The roses were blooming, their petals a violent shade of red that reminded me of the handprint I could still feel burning on my cheek. "I want you to understand something, Marcus," I said without turning around. "That moment when you raised your hand to me? That wasn't just you losing your temper. That was you making a choice. And choices have consequences." When I turned back to face him, I saw something I'd never seen in Marcus's eyes before: genuine fear. Not the performative anxiety he displayed in court for strategic effect, but real, primal terror. The kind that comes when you realize you've been playing chess with someone who's been thinking 12 moves ahead while you were still figuring out how the pieces move. "Sophia, we can work this out," he said, his voice taking on the pleading tone he usually reserved for desperate clients. "Whatever you think I've done, whatever mistakes I might have made, we can fix this. We're married. We're a team." I almost laughed at that. A team? As if the past 6 years had been anything resembling an equal partnership. As if Marcus had ever treated me as anything more than an attractive accessory to his carefully curated life. "You're right about one thing," I said, walking back to the kitchen island and opening a drawer. Inside, organized with the same meticulous care I'd once used to arrange evidence for federal prosecutors, were printed copies of every document, every transaction, every piece of evidence I'd been gathering. "We are going to fix this." Marcus's eyes followed my movements as I pulled out a thick manila folder, its contents representing months of careful investigation and preparation. "But we're not going to fix it together. You see, Marcus, you made another miscalculation tonight." I set the folder on the counter between us, my hand resting on its surface like a pianist preparing to play a complex sonata. "You assumed that hitting me would make me smaller, more controllable, more afraid." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 11 times, its deep brass notes reverberating through our house like a countdown. Tomorrow was Saturday. Marcus's firm was closed on weekends, which meant he had approximately 60 hours before his world imploded in spectacular fashion. Instead, I continued, opening the folder to reveal bank statements, wire transfer records, and client correspondence. It gave me the final piece of justification I needed to stop protecting you from yourself. Marcus reached for the documents with trembling hands, his legal training compelling him to examine the evidence even as his survival instincts screamed at him to run. As he flipped through page after page of damning proof, I watched the last vestiges of his arrogance crumble. "This isn't just embezzlement," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "This is felony theft, money laundering, tax evasion, breach of fiduciary duty, and about 6 other federal charges that carry mandatory minimums," I finished for him. "I'd estimate you're looking at 15 to 20 years, assuming you get a sympathetic judge. Which, given your profession and the amount involved, seems unlikely." The folder contained more than just financial records. I'd documented every client who'd been shortchanged, every family whose settlement had been skimmed, every person whose trust Marcus had violated in service of his own greed. The human cost of his crimes was staggering, and I'd made sure every victim would be clearly identified in my report. "But here's what you don't understand yet," I said, my voice taking on the clinical tone I'd perfected during years of delivering devastating testimony in federal courtrooms. "This isn't about the money. This isn't even about your career, though. Both of those are certainly finished." Marcus looked up from the documents, his face pale and drawn. "Then what is it about?" I walked to our kitchen cabinet and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind I'd used countless times to preserve crucial evidence. The red light indicated it had been running for the past 20 minutes, capturing every word of our conversation, including his implicit admission of guilt. "It's about making sure that what you did to me tonight, what you've probably done to other women, other people you thought were weaker than you, never happens again." The realization hit him like a physical blow. Marcus wasn't just facing financial ruin or professional disgrace. He was facing the complete destruction of everything he'd built, everything he'd worked for, everything he'd believed about his own power and untouchability. "You can't do this," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, we both knew how hollow they sounded. "I'm your husband. We took vows. For better or worse." I pressed the stop button on the recorder and slipped it into my pocket. "You're absolutely right about those vows, Marcus. For better or worse. In sickness and in health. Till death do us part." I moved closer to him, close enough that he could see the slight swelling where his hand had struck my face, close enough that he could smell the faint metallic scent of the blood from my split lip. "But there was one part of those vows that you seem to forget," I whispered. "Love, honor, and cherish. You broke those promises tonight. And once trust is broken, everything else becomes negotiable." Marcus's breathing was shallow now, his lawyer's mind undoubtedly racing through possible defenses, plea bargains, escape routes. But I could see in his eyes that he was beginning to understand the scope of his predicament. This wasn't a case he could argue his way out of. This wasn't a problem he could solve with charm or manipulation or strategic intimidation. This was justice, served cold and with surgical precision. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at my watch. 11:15 p.m. The house felt different now, charged with the electricity that comes before a storm. Everything familiar had become foreign, every shadow had taken on new meaning. Now, I picked up my laptop and the folder of evidence, cradling them like the weapons they'd become. "Now you have until Monday morning to make peace with your choices. At 9 a.m. sharp, copies of everything I've compiled will be delivered to the FBI, the State Bar Association, your firm's managing partners, and the local district attorney's office." Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. "Sophia, please. Think about what you're doing. Think about us, about our life together." I paused at the kitchen doorway, turning back to look at him one last time. In that moment, I saw not the confident attorney who'd swept me off my feet 6 years ago, but a small, frightened man who'd finally encountered a problem he couldn't lawyer away. "I have thought about it, Marcus. I've thought about it every day. For 6 months. I've thought about the families you've stolen from, the trust you've violated, the oath you've broken. And tonight, when you decided that physical violence was an acceptable response to being questioned, you made my decision easy." I headed toward the staircase, my footsteps echoing in the sudden silence of our house. Behind me, I could hear Marcus beginning to pace, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking against the marble in an irregular rhythm of panic. "Sophia," he called after me, his voice cracking with desperation. "We can fix this. We can pay everyone back. I can make this right." I stopped halfway up the stairs, my hand resting on the polished banister. "You're absolutely right about one thing, Marcus. You can make this right. But not with money, and not with me." The guest bedroom had been prepared for this moment, though. Marcus didn't know it yet. For the past month, I'd been quietly moving my most important possessions, my crucial documents, my irreplaceable memories to a safety deposit box across town. The process had been gradual, careful, invisible to someone who'd never paid attention to the details of our shared life. Tonight would be my last night in this house, in this marriage, in the carefully constructed fiction that had defined the past 6 years of my life. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. As I closed the bedroom door behind me, I could hear Marcus on the phone downstairs, his voice muffled but urgent. He was calling his criminal defense attorney, I realized, a smart move, but one that came about 18 months too late. I set my laptop on the small desk by the window and opened it to review the files one final time. Every transaction was documented, every pattern established, every piece of evidence verified and cross-referenced. It was the kind of case that federal prosecutors dream about. Clean, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating. My phone buzzed with a text message from my sister Elena. "How did the confrontation go? Are you safe?" Elena was the only person who knew what I'd discovered, the only one who'd been helping me prepare for this moment. She'd been urging me to leave Marcus for years, long before I'd uncovered his criminal activities. She'd seen something in him that I'd been too in love to recognize, or perhaps too hopeful to acknowledge. "It's done," I typed back. "He showed his true colors. No going back now." Her response came immediately. "Good. You deserve so much better. Call me tomorrow when you're ready." I set the phone aside and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere out there were the families Marcus had cheated, the clients whose trust he'd violated, the colleagues who'd vouched for his integrity without knowing they were endorsing a lie. Tomorrow, justice would begin its slow but inexorable march. Marcus would wake up to discover that his wife had vanished in the night, taking with her not just her personal belongings, but every shred of evidence needed to destroy him completely. The thought should have filled me with satisfaction, but instead I felt something more complex, a mixture of sadness for the man I'd thought I'd married and determination to see justice done for the man he'd actually been. I opened my laptop one final time, navigating to an encrypted folder I'd created months ago. Inside were copies of everything, every document, every recording, every piece of evidence that would soon end Marcus Richardson's career and freedom. But there was something else in that folder, something I'd been saving for this exact moment. A video recording from our kitchen's security camera, automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server. The timestamp showed today's date, and the footage was crystal clear, Marcus striking me across the face, the sound echoing through our marble kitchen, my hand rising instinctively to touch the burning skin, the physical evidence of his violence. Captured in high definition and stored beyond his reach or influence. The final nail in a coffin I'd been building for months. I closed the laptop and began to pack the few remaining items I'd need for tomorrow. As I folded clothes and gathered toiletries, I could hear Marcus downstairs, still on the phone, his Voice growing more frantic as his attorney undoubtedly explained the gravity of his situation. By morning, I would be gone. By Monday, his world would be in ruins. By the time his case went to trial, Marcus Richardson would be just another cautionary tale about power corrupting absolutely, and justice being served to those who thought themselves above the law. But tonight, for the last time, I was still Sophia Richardson, wife of a successful attorney, resident of a beautiful house, keeper of terrible secrets. Tomorrow, I would become something different, the key witness in a federal criminal case, the woman who'd brought down a man who thought he was untouchable, the survivor who'd turned evidence into justice. As I settled into bed for my final night in this house, I touched my cheek gently, feeling the tenderness where Marcus's hand had struck. The physical pain would fade in a few days, but the memory would remain forever, not as a symbol of victimization, but as the moment when I'd finally seen clearly enough to act. Marcus had raised his hand to me once. In response, I'd raised the stakes on his punishment to a level he couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmares, and I was just getting started. I woke at 4:47 a.m. to the sound of silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house, but the heavy, oppressive silence that follows catastrophe. Marcus had finally stopped pacing downstairs sometime after 3 a.m., though I doubted he'd slept. Men like my husband didn't sleep when their carefully constructed worlds began to crumble. They schemed, they planned, they looked for angles and escape routes that didn't exist. The bruise on my cheek had deepened overnight, painting my skin in shades of purple and yellow that no amount of concealer could hide. Good. I wanted it visible, wanted the evidence of his violence documented by every security camera, every witness, every person who would see me in the coming days. My go bag had been packed for weeks, hidden in the back of my closet behind winter coats Marcus never bothered to notice. 3 changes of clothes, essential documents, cash, and the burner phone Elena had given me months ago. Everything else I needed was already waiting at the storage unit I'd rented under my maiden name. I dressed quietly in jeans and a simple sweater, clothes that would make me forgettable to casual observers but photogenic enough for the media interviews that would inevitably come. The irony wasn't lost on me. After 6 years of playing the perfect attorney's wife, I was finally going to be exactly what Marcus had always wanted. Highly visible and completely beyond his control, the house felt different in the pre-dawn darkness. As if it already knew it would soon be evidence in a federal investigation. Every room held memories that felt contaminated now, moments of happiness that I could no longer trust as genuine. Had Marcus ever loved me, or had I simply been a useful prop in his performance of respectability? I made my way downstairs, moving with the practiced silence I'd learned during my FBI days when surveillance meant spending hours motionless in cramped spaces. The kitchen still smelled faintly of Marcus's expensive cologne mixed with the lingering scent of fear-induced sweat. He was slumped over the kitchen island, still in yesterday's suit, surrounded by legal pads covered in his desperate handwriting. Empty coffee cups and crumpled papers littered the marble surface like debris from a shipwreck. His laptop was open to what looked like bank account screens, probably trying to calculate how much money he could access before the authorities froze. Everything too little, too late. I moved past him toward the garage, pausing only to place a single manila envelope on the counter where he'd be sure to see it. Inside were divorce papers I'd had prepared 3 weeks ago, along with a restraining order that would be active the moment I filed it with the courthouse. Marcus Richardson was about to discover that hitting his wife had cost him not just his freedom, but his access to her entirely. The garage door opener had been disconnected from the main house system 2 days ago, a small modification I'd made while Marcus was at work, ensuring my departure would be silent and undetected. My car, a modest Honda Civic I'd bought with cash and registered under my maiden name, sat waiting where I'd hidden it behind Elena's house. The 15-minute walk through our exclusive neighborhood felt surreal in the gray morning light. Every perfectly manicured lawn, every architectural statement home, every symbol of the privileged life I was leaving behind seemed to mock me with their false promise of security. Money couldn't buy safety, I'd learned. Sometimes it just made the cage more gilded. Elena was waiting with coffee and a grim smile when I reached her doorstep. My sister had always been the practical one, the one who asked uncomfortable questions and insisted on uncomfortable truths. She'd never liked Marcus, though she'd been diplomatic enough to keep most of her concerns to herself until recently. "How do you feel?" she asked as I settled into her kitchen, accepting the warmth of the ceramic mug against my palms. "Like I'm about to destroy a man's life," I answered honestly. "And like he absolutely deserves it." Elena studied my face, her eyes lingering on the bruise that had bloomed across my cheek overnight. As a nurse practitioner, she'd seen enough domestic violence to know that last night's slap was rarely an isolated incident. It was typically the moment when psychological abuse escalated to physical violence, when controlling behavior became dangerous behavior. "You know this isn't just about revenge," she said quietly. This is about making sure he can't hurt anyone else. She was right, of course. The evidence I'd compiled told a story that went far beyond financial crimes. Marcus had a pattern of targeting vulnerable clients, of manipulating people in crisis, of using his position of trust to exploit those who had nowhere else to turn. The widow whose settlement he'd skimmed to buy his Rolex. The disabled veteran, whose compensation he'd diverted to fund his gambling habit. The elderly couple whose life savings he'd pillaged to maintain his lifestyle. Each theft was more than just a financial crime, it was a betrayal of people who'd trusted him with their most desperate hopes. The FBI contact? I asked, checking. The secure phone Elena had provided. Agent Sarah Chen. She's expecting your call at 8 a.m. Her team specializes in white-collar crime, and she's already reviewed the preliminary evidence package I sent her. Agent Chen. I remembered her from my FBI days, sharp, methodical, and absolutely ruthless when it came to prosecuting financial crimes. If Marcus thought his connections and legal training would protect him, he was about to learn how wrong that assumption was. At 7:30 a.m., I drove to the downtown Federal Building, timing my arrival for maximum impact. The morning rush hour would ensure plenty of witnesses to see me walking into the FBI field office with visible injuries and a thick folder of evidence. By lunchtime, the legal community's gossip network would be buzzing with speculation about why Marcus Richardson's wife had spent her morning with federal agents. Agent Chen looked exactly as I remembered, mid-40s, steel gray hair pulled back severely, and eyes that missed nothing. Her handshake was firm, professional, and somehow reassuring. After years of being dismissed and underestimated, it felt powerful to be taken seriously by someone who understood the weight of what I was about to do. Mrs. Richardson, she said, leading me into a secure conference room. I've reviewed the preliminary materials your sister provided. Before we begin, I need to make sure you understand the implications of what you're reporting. I touched the bruise on my cheek unconsciously. Agent Chen, my husband hit me last night when I confronted him about stealing from his clients. I spent 5 years as a forensic accountant before I retired, and I've spent the last 6 months documenting every crime he's committed. I understand exactly what I'm doing. Her expression softened slightly, recognition flickering in her eyes. Sophia Martinez. I remember you now. The Kellerman case, the pharmaceutical fraud investigation. You were thorough. I still am. For the next 3 hours, I walked Agent Chen and her team through every piece of evidence I'd compiled. Bank records showing the pattern of theft. Client files demonstrating the scope of his violations. Email correspondences revealing his awareness of wrongdoing. Audio recordings of conversations where he'd admitted to creative accounting with client funds, but the most damning evidence was the security footage from our kitchen, showing Marcus striking me across the face when I'd confronted him about the Thompson contract, a case where he'd stolen $400,000 from a family whose child had been killed by a drunk driver. This is federal court quality work, Agent Chen said finally, reviewing the organized evidence files on her laptop. How long have you been planning this? I wasn't planning anything originally, I admitted. I noticed irregularities in our financial records about 8 months ago. I started investigating because I thought someone might be stealing from us. When I realized Marcus was the thief, I kept digging because I needed to understand the scope of what he'd done. And last night? Last night he showed me who he really is. The man I married wouldn't steal from grieving families. The man I married wouldn't hit his wife for asking questions. Which means the man I married never existed. Agent Chen's team was already moving into action around us, preparing search warrants, coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office, setting up surveillance protocols. The federal government machinery was awakening, turning its attention toward Marcus Richardson with the inexorable force of a glacier. We'll need you to wear a wire, Agent Chen said. If he contacts you, if he tries to negotiate or threaten, we need everything recorded. I nodded, thinking of the divorce papers I'd left on our kitchen counter. He'll contact me. Men like Marcus always think they can talk their way out of consequences. By 11 a.m., I was back in my car, officially transformed from wife to federal informant. The wire was invisible beneath my sweater, its presence a constant reminder that every conversation from now on would become evidence. My old life was officially over. My new role as the key witness in a federal prosecution had begun. My phone buzzed with the first of what would become dozens of frantic calls from Marcus. I let it go to voicemail, following Agent Chen's instructions to let him escalate his desperation before engaging. Each unanswered call would make him more reckless, more likely to say something incriminating. When I finally spoke to him, the text messages started around noon. Sophia, where are you? We need to talk. This is ridiculous. Come home so we can discuss this like adults. You're overreacting. It was just a slap. Just a slap. As if violence became acceptable when it was properly minimized, I drove to the storage unit where I'd been gradually moving my most important possessions, using the time to review my strategy for the coming weeks. The media would eventually learn about the case. They always did when prominent attorneys were arrested. I needed to be ready for the attention, for the questions, for the inevitable attempts to paint me as a vindictive ex-wife rather than a crime victim seeking justice. The storage unit contained more than just my personal belongings. Hidden among boxes of books and old photographs were additional copies of every piece of evidence I'd compiled, stored in fireproof safes and backed up to encrypted cloud servers that Marcus couldn't access or delete. If he tried to destroy evidence at our house, if he attempted to intimidate witnesses or tamper with records, it wouldn't matter. The proof of his crimes existed in multiple secure locations, beyond his reach or influence. My phone rang again. Around 2 p.m. This time it was Marcus's criminal attorney, David Walsh, a man I'd met at numerous social functions, someone who'd complimented my cooking and asked about my graphic design work while secretly knowing his client was a criminal. Sophia, this is David Walsh. Marcus is very concerned about you. He says there was a misunderstanding last night, and he's worried you might do something you'll regret. The paternalistic tone was perfect, designed to make me feel like an emotional woman who needed guidance from wiser male minds. It was exactly the kind of manipulation I'd learned to recognize during my FBI training, the subtle psychological pressure that worked on people who hadn't been taught to resist it. Hello, David, I replied, knowing the conversation was being recorded by the wire I wore. I appreciate your concern, but there was no misunderstanding. Marcus hit me, and I have the evidence to prove it. Now, Sophia, I'm sure it wasn't as serious as it seemed. These things happen in marriages, emotions run high. These things don't happen in my marriage, I interrupted. Or rather, they happened once, and now they'll never happen again. The silence on the other end told me David was beginning to understand that this wasn't a domestic dispute that could be managed with flowers and apologies. This was a federal case building momentum, and his client was at the center of it. Perhaps we could meet for coffee, he suggested carefully. Just to discuss the situation like rational adults. I'm sure we'll have plenty of opportunities to discuss the situation, I replied. In court. I hung up and immediately called Agent Chen to report the contact. Within an hour, David Walsh would be receiving a visit from federal agents, informing him that his client was under investigation, and advising him about the legal implications of attempting to contact witnesses. The afternoon brought more developments. Marcus had apparently shown up at my sister's house, demanding to know where I was. Elena had called the police, and the responding officers had taken a report about his harassment. More evidence for the restraining order I'd file Monday morning. He'd also been to my old office building, somehow convinced that I was hiding there despite the fact that I'd worked from home for years. Security had escorted him out when he became belligerent, and their incident report would become part of the growing file documenting his increasingly erratic behavior. By evening, Marcus was desperate enough to violate the basic rule every criminal attorney teaches their clients: never put anything incriminating in writing. The text messages became increasingly threatening, each one adding to the case for witness intimidation and obstruction of justice. You have no idea what you're dealing with, one message read. I have friends in the prosecutor's office. This will disappear, and you'll be left with nothing. If you think you can destroy me, you're wrong, read another. I know things about your FBI work that could ruin you. Each message was automatically forwarded to Agent Chen's team, each threat documented and catalogued as evidence of his consciousness of guilt. Marcus was doing more to build the case against himself than I could have accomplished with months of additional investigation. The final message arrived just before midnight. I'm going to make you pay for this. You have no idea what I'm capable of when someone betrays me. As threats went, it was both stupid and perfect, clearly intimidating, unambiguously threatening, and absolutely admissible in federal court. Marcus Richardson, Esquire, was building his own conviction. One text message at a time. I forwarded the message to Agent Chen and settled into the hotel room Elena had reserved for me under a false name. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new evidence, new opportunities to demonstrate that domestic violence and financial crimes carried consequences that no amount of legal training could eliminate. Marcus had spent his career teaching clients about the importance of controlling their communications, of never creating evidence that could be used against them, of maintaining disciplined silence when facing investigation. Apparently, those lessons didn't apply when you were the one whose world was collapsing. As I prepared for sleep, I reviewed the day's accomplishments. Evidence delivered to federal agents. Divorce papers served. Restraining order prepared for filing. Safety measures activated. Media strategy planned. Most importantly, Marcus Richardson was beginning to understand that hitting his wife hadn't made her more manageable. It had made her more dangerous than he'd ever imagined possible, and I was just getting started. Monday morning arrived with the precision of a Swiss timepiece and the inevitability of gravity. At exactly 6 a.m., federal agents knocked on the door of what had been our home, armed with search warrants that would turn Marcus's carefully curated life inside out. I wasn't there to witness his face when reality finally crashed through his delusions of control, but Agent Chen's team had thoughtfully equipped the operation with body cameras. I watched the footage later from the secure viewing room at the federal building, studying Marcus's expression as agents systematically dismantled his study, photographed his computer equipment, and boxed up files he'd thought were safely hidden. The man who'd slapped me Friday night looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 days. He's been awake for approximately 60 hours, Agent Chen observed, pointing to the dark circles under Marcus's eyes and the tremor in his hands. Sleep deprivation makes people careless. They say things they shouldn't, make mistakes they wouldn't normally make. The search was yielding exactly what we'd expected: encrypted drives containing client files, offshore banking information, and a detailed record of every theft Marcus had committed over the past 2 years. His home office had been transformed into a crime scene, yellow tape and evidence markers replacing the expensive law books and framed photographs that had once projected success and respectability, but the real treasure was his phone, which contained months of communications with his stockbroker, his accountant, and his gambling contacts in Atlantic City. Marcus had been living a double life that went far beyond embezzlement. He'd been systematically feeding his gambling addiction with stolen client funds, creating a cycle of theft that had spiraled completely out of control. The betting records show losses of over $800,000 in the past 18 months, Agent Chen's financial analyst reported, spreading printouts across the conference table. He was stealing from new clients to cover losses from previous thefts, then stealing more to cover the new thefts. Classic Ponzi scheme psychology. I thought about the nights Marcus had claimed to be working late, the weekend legal conferences that never appeared on his calendar, the mysterious phone calls he'd taken private. He'd been living at the casino, burning through other people's money while I sat at home believing his lies about building our future together. The courthouse clerk stamped my restraining order application at 9:15 a.m., making it official. Marcus Richardson was legally prohibited from contacting me, approaching me, or coming within 500 feet of my location. The bruise on my face had photographed beautifully for the court filing, providing undeniable visual evidence of his violence. Judge Morrison, a woman who'd built her career prosecuting domestic violence cases, reviewed my application with the thoroughness it deserved. When she granted the emergency order, her words were sharp and unambiguous. Mr. Richardson's behavior demonstrates a clear pattern of escalating abuse and intimidation. This court will not tolerate violence against women, regardless of the perpetrator's professional status. By 10 a.m., Marcus's law firm had been served with federal subpoenas demanding every file, every computer, every piece of correspondence related to his practice. The managing partners, men who'd considered Marcus a rising star, who'd trusted him with the firm's most valuable clients, were discovering that their golden boy had been systematically looting client settlements for years. I received a call from Margaret Whitfield, the firm's senior partner, around noon. Her voice was carefully controlled, the kind of professional composure that barely contained volcanic fury. "Mrs. Richardson, I need you to understand that Whitfield, Carson and Associates had no knowledge of your husband's alleged activities. We are cooperating fully with federal investigators and conducting our own internal review." "I understand, Margaret," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I hope the firm's clients receive the justice they deserve." "We're establishing a victim compensation fund," she continued, clearly reading from prepared remarks. "Every client who was harmed will be made whole, regardless of the financial impact to the firm." What she didn't say, but what we both understood, was that Marcus's crimes would likely destroy one of the city's most prestigious law firms. The reputational damage alone would drive away clients, while the financial liability could bankrupt partners who'd built their careers on the assumption that their colleagues were honest. The afternoon brought news that Marcus had been arrested trying to board a flight to the Cayman Islands. Airport security had detained him when his passport was flagged in the federal database, and searching his luggage had revealed $50,000 in cash and a detailed plan to access offshore accounts he'd established using stolen client funds. "Flight risk doesn't begin to describe it," Agent Chen said when she called to update me. He had fake identification documents, prepaid credit cards, and contact information for money laundering services in 3 different countries. This wasn't a panicked escape attempt, this was a carefully planned disappearance strategy. The arrest footage played on local news that evening, showing Marcus in handcuffs being led through the airport terminal while reporters shouted questions about his alleged crimes. The man who'd once commanded respect in every courtroom in the state was now just another defendant, shuffling toward a federal holding cell in shackles and shame, but the real prize came when federal agents executed a warrant on Marcus's safety deposit box. Inside, they discovered not just additional cash and documents, but photographs and video recordings that revealed the true depth of his criminality. Marcus had been blackmailing clients. The evidence was horrifying in its calculated cruelty: surveillance photos of a client's extramarital affair, recordings of confidential conversations, financial documents obtained through illegal access to private accounts. He'd been using privileged information to manipulate vulnerable people, threatening to expose their secrets unless they agreed to inflated legal fees and suspicious settlement arrangements. This elevates the charges significantly, Agent Chen explained during our evening briefing. We're no longer just looking at embezzlement and tax evasion. This is racketeering, extortion, and violation of attorney-client privilege on a scale that could result in a life sentence. I thought about the clients I'd met at firm social functions, the people who'd trusted Marcus with their most devastating legal problems. The widow whose husband's death benefits Marcus had stolen while she grieved. The disabled veteran Marcus had blackmailed using medical records that should have been confidential. The elderly couple whose life savings Marcus had looted while threatening to expose their son's drug addiction. Each victim represented more than just financial loss. They were people whose faith in the legal system had been utterly destroyed by someone they'd trusted with their most desperate hopes. My phone buzzed with a call from David Walsh, Marcus's attorney. I let it go to voicemail, knowing that every contact attempt was being recorded and analyzed by federal agents. His message was exactly what I'd expected: professional concern masking barely contained panic. Sophia, this is David again. Marcus is in a very difficult situation, and I think we can resolve this matter if we all approach it reasonably. There may have been some irregularities in his accounting, but nothing that can't be corrected with proper restitution. Please call me when you have a moment to discuss this privately. Irregularities in his accounting. As if systematic theft, blackmail, and racketeering were simple bookkeeping errors that could be resolved with an apology and a payment plan. I forwarded the message to Agent Chen and settled into my hotel room to review the latest developments. The federal case was building momentum like an avalanche, gathering evidence and witnesses with each passing hour. Marcus's former clients were coming forward with stories of suspicious behavior, irregular billing, and settlement amounts that didn't match their expectations. The victim impact statements were devastating. Sarah Martinez, whose child support settlement Marcus had skimmed while threatening to expose her immigration status. Robert Chen, whose workers' compensation claim Marcus had manipulated while blackmailing him with evidence of prior marijuana use. Patricia Williams, whose inheritance Marcus had looted while threatening to reveal her family's mental health history. Each statement painted a picture of systematic predatory behavior that went far beyond simple greed. Marcus had been targeting the most vulnerable people in society: recent immigrants, disabled veterans, grieving families, and exploiting their desperation for his own benefit. The media attention was intensifying by the hour. Local news stations had picked up the story, focusing on the dramatic fall of a respected attorney and the brave wife who'd exposed his crimes. My FBI background had been discovered by reporters, adding another layer of intrigue to the narrative. Former federal agent brings down criminal husband, read one headline. Attorney's wife turns tables on abusive spouse, proclaimed another. I'd given one carefully prepared interview, focusing on the victims of Marcus's crimes rather than my personal story. The bruise on my cheek was still visible, providing stark visual evidence of the violence that had triggered my decision to act. This isn't about revenge, I'd told the reporter. This is about ensuring that people who trusted Marcus Richardson with their legal problems receive the justice they deserve. Elena called around 10 p.m. with updates from the neighborhood gossip network. Our house was surrounded by news vans and federal agents, the driveway blocked by crime scene tape and evidence vehicles. Neighbors who'd envied our lifestyle for years were now whispering about how they'd always suspected something wasn't right about Marcus. Mrs. Patterson from across the street says she saw you leaving with a suitcase early Saturday morning, Elena reported. She's telling everyone she always knew you were too good for him. Mrs. Patterson had never spoken to me beyond polite nods at the mailbox, but revisionist history was a common response to shocking revelations. People needed to believe they'd seen the warning signs, that they wouldn't have been fooled by Marcus's performance of respectability. The truth was that Marcus had been exceptionally good at hiding his criminality. His thefts had been carefully calculated to avoid detection, his blackmail schemes had been precisely targeted at victims unlikely to report them, and his public persona had been crafted to deflect suspicion. If I hadn't been a trained forensic accountant, if I hadn't possessed the skills and knowledge necessary to recognize the patterns, his crimes might have continued for years before being discovered. Tuesday morning brought news that Marcus's bail hearing had been delayed due to the flight risk he demonstrated at the airport. His attorney was arguing for house arrest and electronic monitoring, but federal prosecutors were demanding he remain in custody pending trial. The defendant has demonstrated clear intent to flee the jurisdiction, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Collins argued in court. He was arrested attempting to access offshore accounts containing stolen funds, carrying fake identification, and implementing a sophisticated escape plan. No amount of monitoring can guarantee his appearance at trial. The judge agreed, ordering Marcus held without bail pending his arraignment on the expanded charges. The man who'd once been a fixture at the country club and charity galas would be spending the foreseeable future in a federal detention facility, wearing orange jumpsuits instead of Italian suits. I watched the hearing via video link from the FBI field office, studying Marcus's face as the reality of his situation fully penetrated his consciousness. This wasn't a case he could plea bargain away or a problem he could solve with connections and charm. This was a federal racketeering prosecution with overwhelming evidence and multiple victims demanding justice. Agent Chen's team was preparing for a long investigation, but the evidence we'd already gathered was more than sufficient to guarantee conviction on the major charges. Marcus Richardson's legal career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and his freedom would be measured in decades rather than years. Phase 1 complete, Agent Chen said as we reviewed the case file. Now we focus on recovering assets for the victims and building an airtight case for trial. But I knew this was just the beginning. Marcus had connections throughout the legal community, friends who might try to help him, colleagues who might attempt to minimize his crimes or shift blame to others. The federal prosecution would take months or years to complete, and every step would require vigilance to ensure justice was truly served. Most importantly, there were still victims who hadn't come forward, people too frightened or ashamed to admit they'd been blackmailed or manipulated. My role was expanding beyond witness to advocate, helping other survivors find their voices and seek their own justice. Marcus had raised his hand to me once, thinking it would make me smaller and more controllable. Instead, it had awakened something he couldn't have imagined, a federal case that would become a model for prosecuting predatory attorneys, a reckoning that would reshape how the legal profession policed itself, and we were just getting started. The first death threat arrived on Wednesday morning, slipped under my hotel room door while I slept. The message was typed on expensive letterhead from Blackstone and Associates, one of the city's most powerful law firms, and the words were chosen with the precision of someone who understood the legal boundaries of intimidation. Mrs. Richardson, your vendetta against your husband is destroying innocent people's livelihoods. Reconsider your testimony before you find yourself facing consequences you haven't anticipated. I photographed the letter and immediately called Agent Chen, who dispatched a forensics team to process the hotel room for evidence. Within 2 hours, federal agents were executing a search warrant at Blackstone and Associates, seizing computers and documents while partners watched their carefully cultivated reputations crumble in real time. Threatening a federal witness is a serious felony, Agent Chen explained as we reviewed the surveillance footage from the hotel's security cameras. Whoever delivered this letter just graduated from observer to participant in our investigation. The footage was remarkably clear. Thomas Blackstone himself, managing partner of the firm, entering the hotel at 3:47 a.m. and leaving 17 minutes later. His expensive Bentley was captured on 3 different traffic cameras along his route, providing an unbreakable chain of evidence connecting him to witness intimidation. He couldn't have been stupid enough to personally deliver a threatening letter, I said, studying the images. Unless he's more involved in Marcus's crimes than we initially suspected, Agent Chen finished. Financial criminals rarely operate in isolation. They need lawyers to hide money, accountants to manipulate records, and business partners to provide legitimacy. The revelation that Marcus had powerful allies actively working to protect him shouldn't have surprised me, but it added a new dimension of danger to an already complex situation. I wasn't just fighting one corrupt attorney, I was taking on an entire network of influential people who had reasons to keep Marcus's secrets buried. By Thursday, the federal investigation had expanded to include Blackstone and Associates, revealing a sophisticated money laundering operation that had been hiding criminal proceeds for years. Marcus hadn't just been stealing from clients, he'd been part of a larger conspiracy involving some of the city's most respected legal professionals. The evidence was devastating: encrypted communications between Marcus and Thomas Blackstone, discussing difficult clients who needed to be managed more carefully. Bank records showing payments from Blackstone's firm to offshore accounts controlled by Marcus. Meeting logs indicating regular strategy sessions about how to minimize exposure risk from victim complaints. We're looking at a criminal enterprise, Agent Chen announced during our daily briefing. Marcus was the frontline operator, stealing from clients and intimidating victims. Blackstone was the money man, helping to hide proceeds and eliminate evidence. Together, they've been running a predatory legal practice that targeted vulnerable people for systematic exploitation. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Over a dozen attorneys at various firms had been feeding information to Marcus about clients with substantial settlements or inheritances. He would then manipulate cases to maximize his access to their money, using blackmail and intimidation to prevent victims from reporting suspicious activity, but the network had made a crucial error. They'd assumed that Marcus's wife was just another potential victim to be managed and controlled. They'd underestimated the threat posed by someone with federal law enforcement training who had access to all of Marcus's personal information. My phone rang constantly now with calls from reporters, victims' rights advocates, and other attorneys who wanted to distance themselves from the scandal. I'd hired my own criminal defense attorney, Sarah Kim, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in protecting witnesses in high-profile cases. "You need to understand that you're not just testifying against your husband anymore," Sarah explained during our first meeting. "You're taking on a criminal organization that has significant resources and powerful connections. They will try everything to discredit your testimony." The attacks began almost immediately. Anonymous posts appeared on social media claiming I was a bitter ex-wife seeking revenge for Marcus's imaginary affair. Fake documents surfaced suggesting I'd been involved in the financial crimes myself. Professional trolls flooded news comment sections with character assassination attempts designed to undermine my credibility, but the most insidious attack came from Marcus's mother, Catherine Richardson, a prominent socialite who'd spent decades building influence through charitable work and political connections. She held a press conference outside the federal courthouse, tearfully proclaiming her son's innocence while painting me as a manipulative woman who'd seduced him into crime. "Marcus is a good man who made some poor decisions," she told the assembled reporters, dabbing her eyes with an expensive handkerchief. "His wife has twisted financial irregularities into criminal accusations because she wants to destroy him for leaving her." The performance was masterful, a grieving mother defending her child against false accusations from a vindictive spouse. The fact that Marcus had never left me, that he'd been arrested trying to flee the country, that overwhelming evidence supported every charge against him, were details that got lost in the emotional appeal. The media coverage began shifting subtly as Catherine Richardson's wealth and connections influenced editorial decisions. Stories about Marcus's victims were buried on inside pages while front-page articles questioned whether federal prosecutors were overreaching in their pursuit of a respected attorney. "This is how powerful people protect themselves," Sarah explained. As we reviewed the coverage, they don't challenge the evidence directly, they attack the narrative, create doubt about motivations, make the victims seem less sympathetic than the perpetrators. But Catherine Richardson had made the same mistake as her son. She'd underestimated the determination of someone fighting for justice rather than personal gain. I'd been documenting her interference in the investigation, recording the threatening phone calls from her attorneys, photographing the private investigators she'd hired to follow me. "Elena called me Friday evening with disturbing news. There's been a break-in at your storage unit. Nothing was taken, but everything was searched." Professional job, whoever did it knew exactly what they were looking for. I wasn't surprised. The criminal network protecting Marcus would have assumed I'd hidden evidence in multiple locations, and they'd be systematically trying to eliminate anything that could be used against them. What they didn't know was that my FBI training had taught me to create redundant security systems that made evidence theft nearly impossible. "Let me guess," I said. "They focused on the boxes containing financial documents and ignored the personal belongings." "Exactly. How did you know?" "Because they're thinking like criminals instead of investigators. They're looking for evidence to destroy rather than understanding how evidence is actually preserved and protected." The break-in had been anticipated and prepared for. Every document they'd searched through was a copy, every file they'd examined was a decoy. The real evidence existed in encrypted digital format stored on secure government servers that no amount of money or influence could access. More importantly, their break-in had been recorded by hidden cameras I'd installed weeks earlier. Federal agents now had video footage of Marcus's associates committing felony burglary while attempting to obstruct justice, additional charges that would strengthen the overall case. Saturday brought news that shook the legal community to its core. Thomas Blackstone had been arrested at his country club while playing golf with a federal judge. The charges included racketeering, money laundering, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. His bail was set at $5 million, reflecting both his flight risk and the severity of his alleged crimes. The arrest sent shockwaves through the city's power structure. Blackstone wasn't just another crooked lawyer, he was a political kingmaker who'd financed campaigns, influenced judicial appointments, and shaped legal policy for decades. His downfall exposed the depth of corruption that had infected the entire legal system, but the most significant development came Sunday morning when I received an unexpected visitor at my hotel. Maria Santos, one of Marcus's former clients, knocked on my door at 7 a.m. with tears in her eyes and a manila folder in her hands. "Mrs. Richardson, I saw you on the news," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I need to tell you what your husband did to my family." Maria's story was heartbreaking in its cruelty. Marcus had represented her in a wrongful death lawsuit after her teenage son was killed by a drunk driver. The settlement should have been $1.2 million, but Marcus had convinced her to accept $800,000 by claiming the insurance company was threatening to appeal and delay payment for years. She'd trusted him completely, signing documents she didn't understand, while grieving for her dead child. Only later did she discover that Marcus had collected the full $1.2 million and pocketed the difference, using her son's death to fund his gambling addiction. "But that's not the worst part," Maria continued, opening her folder to reveal photographs and documents. "When I started asking questions about the settlement amount, he threatened to have me deported. He said he had connections with immigration enforcement who would make problems for my family." The documents she showed me were devastating, forged immigration papers that Marcus had used to intimidate Maria, fake deportation orders that had terrorized her into silence, and recordings of conversations where he'd explicitly threatened her family's safety. "I've been afraid to come forward for 2 years," she admitted. "But when I saw your bruise on television, when I heard you talking about getting justice for victims, I knew I had to be brave too." Maria's testimony would be crucial to the federal case, providing direct evidence of Marcus's blackmail schemes and predatory targeting of vulnerable immigrants. But more importantly, her courage in coming forward would inspire other victims to break their silence and seek justice. I called Agent Chen immediately, and within hours Maria was giving a formal statement to federal investigators. Her evidence filled crucial gaps in the prosecution's case while revealing new victims who hadn't previously been identified. "This changes everything," Agent Chen said after reviewing Maria's materials. "We now have direct testimony about threats, intimidation, and document fraud. Marcus wasn't just stealing money, he was terrorizing entire families into submission." The weekend also brought news that Catherine Richardson was under investigation for her role in coordinating the campaign to discredit my testimony. Federal agents had intercepted communications between her and a public relations firm that specialized in crisis management for wealthy criminals. The communications revealed a sophisticated strategy to destroy my credibility through character assassination, planted stories, and coordinated social media attacks. Catherine had spent over $200,000 in just 1 week trying to protect her son by destroying his victim's reputation, but perhaps the most satisfying development was the discovery that Marcus's arrest had triggered a cascade of consequences he hadn't anticipated. His gambling debts, which he'd been servicing with stolen client funds, were now coming due with no way to pay them. The casino enforcers who'd been his business partners were becoming his enemies, adding physical danger to his legal problems. He owes approximately $300,000 to some very unforgiving people, Agent Chen reported with grim satisfaction. "Federal custody is probably the safest place for him right now." The irony was perfect. Marcus had spent years terrorizing vulnerable people with threats of violence and deportation, and now he was the one living in fear of both legal consequences and physical retribution. As Sunday evening approached, I reviewed the week's developments from my hotel room. A criminal conspiracy had been exposed, powerful allies had been neutralized, additional victims had found their voices, and the evidence against Marcus continued to grow stronger with each passing day, but I knew the real battle was just beginning. Wealthy criminals didn't surrender easily, and Marcus's network still had resources to fight back. They would continue trying to discredit me, intimidate other witnesses, and manipulate the legal system to protect themselves. However, they'd made one crucial miscalculation. They'd assumed that intimidation would work against someone who'd spent years investigating federal crimes. Instead, every threat strengthened my resolve, every attack provided additional evidence, and every attempt to silence me made the eventual victory more complete. Marcus had hit me once, thinking it would make me more manageable. Instead, it had unleashed a federal investigation that was systematically dismantling everything he and his criminal associates had built, and the best part was that we were still gathering momentum. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor to Agent Chen's office, Detective Rachel Morrison from the Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. Her grim expression and the thick file folder she carried told me that Marcus's criminal network had deeper roots than we'd discovered. "We need to talk," Detective Morrison said, settling into the conference room chair across from me. "Your husband's case has exposed something we've been investigating for 3 years. We have a problem with dirty cops." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Marcus hadn't just corrupted attorneys and business partners, he'd been paying off police officers to suppress victim complaints, intimidate witnesses, and provide advance warning about investigations. The very people who should have been protecting his victims had been protecting him instead. Officer Kevin Martinez, Sergeant Linda Walsh, Detective James Cooper, Morrison continued, spreading photographs across the table. All of them were on Marcus's payroll. When victims tried to file complaints, these officers would bury the reports or convince people that pursuing charges would be hopeless. The scope of the corruption was staggering. For years, Marcus and his associates had operated with impunity because they'd infiltrated the very system designed to hold them accountable. Victims who'd tried to report blackmail or theft had been turned away by corrupt officers who were being paid to protect the perpetrators. How many victims never got justice because their complaints disappeared? I asked, thinking about all the people who'd suffered in silence while their tormentors lived in luxury. We're still calculating that number, Morrison admitted. But preliminary estimates suggest dozens of cases were suppressed or manipulated over the past 5 years. Your evidence is helping us identify patterns we couldn't see before. Agent Chen pulled up a digital map on her laptop, showing the connections between various members of Marcus's criminal enterprise. Red lines connected corrupt police officers to compromised attorneys, who were linked to money launderers and evidence destroyers. The web of corruption stretched throughout the city's power structure like a cancer. This is why they're fighting so hard to discredit your testimony, Agent Chen explained. If Marcus goes down, he'll take half the city's establishment with him. The stakes go far beyond one corrupt attorney. We're looking at a complete breakdown of institutional trust. The morning brought more disturbing news. Someone had leaked my new address to Marcus's supporters, forcing another emergency relocation. This time, Agent Chen insisted on placing me in a federal safe house with round-the-clock protection. The threats are escalating, she explained as we drove to the secure location. Catherine Richardson has hired a private military contractor to conduct surveillance on federal witnesses. These aren't lawyers anymore, they're mercenaries. The safe house was a nondescript suburban home that had been equipped with sophisticated security systems and staffed by armed federal marshals. It felt surreal to be living under protection from people who should have been pillars of the community, but Marcus's network had demonstrated they would use any means necessary to silence opposition. Tuesday afternoon brought a breakthrough that changed everything. Agent Chen's Financial Crimes Unit had finally cracked the encryption on Marcus's offshore accounts, revealing the true magnitude of his theft and the identity of his international partners. $4.7 million, Agent Chen announced, projecting bank records onto the conference room screen. That's how much he stole over 3 years, not counting the money he lost gambling or spent on bribes. But the real shock was discovering who had been helping him hide the money. Marcus's financial advisor, Patricia Williams, wasn't just managing his investments, she was running a sophisticated money laundering operation that served dozens of corrupt professionals throughout the region. Williams has been cleaning dirty money for judges, prosecutors, police commanders, and city council members, Agent Chen continued. Marcus was just one client in a criminal enterprise that's been operating for over a decade. The revelation meant that nearly every institution tasked with maintaining law and order had been compromised. Judges who should have been imposing harsh sentences were taking bribes to reduce charges. Prosecutors who should have been seeking justice were being paid to lose cases. Police commanders who should have been investigating crimes were covering them up instead. How did it get this bad? I asked, overwhelmed by the scope of the corruption. Slowly, then all at once, Agent Chen replied. It starts with small favors, minor compromises, seemingly harmless arrangements. Before anyone realizes what's happening, the entire system is infected. Wednesday brought news that sent shockwaves through the federal courthouse. Judge Harold Bennett, who was scheduled to preside over Marcus's trial, had been arrested for accepting bribes. The case would need to be reassigned to a different jurisdiction to ensure fairness, a delay that Marcus's lawyers would undoubtedly try to exploit, but the most significant development came when my own attorney, Sarah Kim, uncovered evidence that Catherine Richardson had been attempting to bribe federal agents. FBI surveillance had captured her meeting with someone she believed was a corrupt agent willing to provide information about the investigation. She offered $500,000 for details about prosecution strategy and witness protection protocols, Sarah reported with obvious satisfaction. Unfortunately for her, the corrupt agent was actually an undercover federal investigator gathering evidence of obstruction of justice. Catherine Richardson's arrest made front-page news across the country. The image of the prominent socialite being led away in handcuffs while reporters shouted questions about her son's crimes became an instant symbol of how justice could reach anyone, regardless of wealth or social status. The Richardson family corruption runs deep, the headlines proclaimed. Mother and son criminal enterprise exposed by brave whistleblower wife. The media narrative was finally shifting in favor of truth and justice. Catherine Richardson's attempts to manipulate coverage had backfired spectacularly, generating sympathy for me while exposing the lengths to which wealthy criminals would go to avoid accountability. Thursday brought a parade of new victims willing to testify now that they'd seen powerful people being held accountable. The Federal Building's Victim Services Office was overwhelmed with people coming forward to report crimes that had been covered up for years. Robert Chen, a construction worker whose disability settlement Marcus had stolen, brought medical records showing how the theft had prevented him from getting necessary surgery. I've been in pain for 2 years because that man took money that was supposed to pay for my treatment, he said, tears streaming down his face. Jennifer Walsh, a single mother whose child support enforcement case Marcus had sabotaged, presented evidence showing how he deliberately delayed proceedings to increase his billable hours while her children went without basic necessities. He knew my kids were hungry, and he didn't care as long as he was getting paid. Each victim's story added another layer to the prosecution's case while demonstrating the human cost of Marcus's crimes. These weren't victimless financial manipulations, they were deliberate acts of cruelty that had caused real suffering to real families. Friday afternoon brought the news I'd been waiting for. Marcus had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His attorney had finally convinced him that fighting the charges was hopeless given the overwhelming evidence and the collapse of his support network. He's willing to testify against his co-conspirators, Agent Chen announced during our briefing. But he wants immunity from prosecution for any crimes that haven't been discovered yet. The offer was laughable. Marcus was trying to negotiate from a position of weakness, apparently still believing he had leverage in a situation where he was completely exposed. Federal prosecutors rejected his proposal within hours, making it clear that cooperation would be rewarded but not with a free pass for unknown crimes. But Marcus's willingness to discuss cooperation revealed something important. He was finally understanding that his criminal enterprise was collapsing beyond repair. The man who'd spent years believing himself untouchable was discovering that federal investigators were methodical, thorough, and completely immune to the intimidation tactics that had worked on local authorities. The weekend brought a development that surprised everyone. Thomas Blackstone's wife, Margaret, contacted federal agents requesting a meeting. She'd been married to one of the city's most powerful attorneys for 30 years, but she'd apparently been documenting his crimes for much longer than that. I've been keeping records for 15 years, she told Agent Chen during a secret meeting at the federal building. I knew something was wrong, but I was afraid to come forward because he threatened to have me committed to a mental institution if I ever crossed him. Margaret Blackstone's evidence was extraordinary: detailed financial records, recordings of criminal conversations, photographs of incriminating documents, and a comprehensive diary documenting her husband's illegal activities. She'd been building a case against him for over a decade, waiting for the right moment to act. Why now? I asked when Agent Chen briefed me about the meeting. Because she saw what you did, Agent Chen replied with a slight smile. You showed her that it was possible to fight back against an abusive husband and win. Your courage gave her the strength to find her own voice. Margaret Blackstone's cooperation would be devastating to the criminal network. She had insider knowledge of money laundering operations, bribery schemes, and evidence destruction that went back years. Her testimony could connect crimes that seemed unrelated and reveal patterns that investigators had missed, but perhaps most importantly, her decision to come forward demonstrated that the culture of silence and intimidation that had protected Marcus's network was finally breaking down. When the wives of powerful criminals began testifying against their husbands, the entire foundation of the criminal enterprise started to crumble. Sunday evening brought a moment of quiet reflection as I prepared for what would be the most challenging phase of the prosecution. The federal grand jury would begin hearing evidence the following week, starting the formal process that would determine Marcus's fate and the fate of everyone who'd protected him. I thought about the Friday night when Marcus had raised his hand to me, believing that violence would solve his problems and make me more manageable. He'd wanted to silence my questions about his crimes, to intimidate me into submission, to maintain control over a situation that was already spiraling beyond his ability to manage. Instead, that moment of violence had unleashed forces he couldn't have imagined. A federal investigation that had exposed institutional corruption. A coalition of victims who'd found their voices and demanded justice. A community of women who discovered they didn't have to accept abuse from powerful men. The bruise on my cheek had faded weeks ago, but its impact continued to reverberate throughout the legal system. Every arrest, every conviction, every moment of accountability could be traced back to Marcus's decision to use violence when words failed him. Agent Chen called me Sunday night with a final update. The grand jury will hear your testimony Tuesday morning. Are you ready? I looked around the safe house that had become my temporary home, thinking about all the people who were depending on my testimony to deliver justice they'd been denied for years. Marcus's victims, Margaret Blackstone, Maria Santos, and countless others who'd suffered in silence while powerful criminals operated with impunity. I'm ready, I replied. I've been ready since the moment he hit me. Because this was never just about Marcus Richardson and his crimes. This was about proving that no one, regardless of wealth or influence or social status, was above the law. This was about showing other victims that they didn't have to accept injustice as inevitable. This was about making sure that raising a hand in violence had consequences that no amount of money or power could erase, and we were about to deliver those consequences in full. The federal courthouse felt different on Tuesday morning. Where it had once represented the dignified administration of justice, it now seemed like a fortress under siege. Metal detectors had been reinforced, additional security personnel patrolled every entrance, and bomb-sniffing dogs conducted sweeps of public areas. The corruption Marcus had exposed had shaken the legal community so thoroughly that no one felt safe anymore. I arrived through a secured underground entrance, flanked by federal marshals who'd become my constant companions over the past 2 weeks. The grand jury room was smaller than I'd expected, 23 citizens sitting in comfortable chairs, their faces reflecting the gravity of what they were about to hear. Mrs. Richardson, the prosecutor began, please tell the grand jury how you first discovered your husband's criminal activities. For the next 6 hours, I walked them through every detail of Marcus's crimes. The offshore accounts he'd established using stolen client identities. The sophisticated blackmail operation that had terrorized vulnerable families for years. The network of corrupt officials who'd helped him escape accountability while his victims suffered in silence. But the most powerful moment came when I described the night Marcus had hit me, the security footage playing on screens throughout the room. You could hear the collective intake of breath as 23 people watched a respected attorney strike his wife across the face when she dared to question his criminal behavior. That violence wasn't an isolated incident, I explained to the silent room. It was the logical conclusion of a mindset that viewed other people as obstacles to be eliminated rather than human beings deserving of respect. Marcus didn't just steal money, he stole dignity, security, and hope from everyone who trusted him. The grand jurors asked detailed questions about the evidence, clearly struggling to comprehend the scope of the corruption. How had so many supposed pillars of the community become involved in systematic criminality? How had the institutions designed to protect citizens become vehicles for exploiting them instead? Corruption is like cancer, I told them. It starts small and grows slowly, spreading through connections and relationships until it infects entire systems. Marcus wasn't operating alone, he was part of a criminal enterprise that had been growing for over a decade. During the lunch break, Agent Chen updated me on developments that had occurred while I was testifying. Marcus's former law firm had filed for bankruptcy, unable to survive the reputational damage and legal liability from his crimes. 3 more police officers had been arrested as the internal affairs investigation expanded. 2 judges had resigned rather than face federal indictment. The entire legal establishment is collapsing, Agent Chen reported with grim satisfaction. Every institution that enabled Marcus's crimes is facing consequences. But the most significant news was that Marcus himself had requested another meeting with prosecutors. His attorney, David Walsh, was apparently trying to negotiate a plea bargain that would avoid a trial and the publicity that would come with it. What's he offering? I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. Full cooperation against his co-conspirators in exchange for a reduced sentence, Agent Chen replied. He's finally understanding that his only hope is to provide information about other criminals in the network. The afternoon session focused on the victims, the families whose lives had been destroyed by Marcus's greed and cruelty. I testified about Maria Santos, whose teenage son's death had been exploited to fund Marcus's gambling addiction. I described Robert Chen, whose disability benefits had been stolen while he suffered in chronic pain. I detailed Jennifer Walsh's struggle to feed her children while Marcus deliberately delayed her child support case to increase his billable hours. Each story was documented with bank records, medical reports, and recordings that made the human cost of financial crimes impossible to ignore. These weren't abstract legal violations, they were deliberate acts of cruelty perpetrated against people who'd trusted the legal system to protect them. Mrs. Richardson, one grand juror asked, how do we know this pattern won't just repeat itself with different people? It was the question I'd been hoping someone would ask, the opportunity to explain why this case mattered beyond just punishing Marcus and his associates. Because sunlight is the best disinfectant, I replied. For years, these crimes continued because they happened in darkness, protected by a culture of silence and intimidation. When victims tried to come forward, they were ignored or threatened into submission. When journalists tried to investigate, they were blocked by powerful interests. I gestured toward the evidence displays surrounding us. But now everything is documented, recorded, and preserved. The evidence of corruption is so overwhelming that denial is impossible. The media attention is so intense that cover-ups are futile. Most importantly, other victims have seen that justice is possible, and they're finding the courage to demand accountability. The grand jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with their decision: true bills on all charges against Marcus, Thomas Blackstone, Catherine Richardson, and 14 other members of their criminal enterprise. The formal indictments would include racketeering, money laundering, bribery, witness intimidation, and dozens of other federal crimes, but the real victory came when Agent Chen informed me that Marcus had finally agreed to cooperate without conditions. The prospect of facing a federal trial with overwhelming evidence had broken his resolve completely. He's willing to testify against everyone, Agent Chen reported. Judges, prosecutors, police commanders, business partners, he's giving up the entire network in exchange for a recommendation for leniency at sentencing. Wednesday morning brought Marcus's first formal cooperation session, conducted in a secure conference room at the federal building. I wasn't present for the interrogation, but Agent Chen briefed me on the revelations that emerged from Marcus's confession. The criminal enterprise had been even more extensive than investigators had suspected. Marcus identified 37 public officials who'd received bribes, 16 businesses that had been used to launder money, and over 200 victims whose cases had been manipulated for criminal gain. He's been talking for 12 hours straight. Agent Chen told me during a brief break. The amount of information he's providing will keep federal prosecutors busy for years. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was that Marcus's violence toward me hadn't been an isolated incident. He'd physically assaulted other victims who'd questioned his handling of their cases, using intimidation and fear to maintain control over people who might expose his crimes. 3 women have already come forward with similar stories, Agent Chen continued. He had a pattern of escalating from financial manipulation to physical violence when his other control methods failed. The revelation added assault charges to Marcus's growing list of federal crimes while demonstrating that domestic violence was just another tool in his arsenal of victim control. The man who'd claimed that hitting me was an isolated mistake caused by stress had actually been using violence as a systematic method of silencing opposition. Thursday brought news that the corruption investigation was expanding beyond the local level. Federal agents in 3 other states had opened related cases after discovering that Marcus's money laundering network had operated across state lines. The criminal enterprise that had seemed limited to one city was actually part of a regional conspiracy involving hundreds of corrupt officials. This is becoming one of the largest corruption cases in federal history, Agent Chen announced during our briefing. The evidence Marcus is providing is exposing criminal networks we didn't know existed. But the most personally satisfying development was learning that every victim whose case Marcus had manipulated would receive full restitution. The federal government had seized all of his assets, including our house, his luxury cars, and the offshore accounts where he'd hidden stolen funds. Insurance policies and Bar Association victim compensation funds would cover any shortfalls. Maria Santos will finally get the full settlement her son's death should have provided, Agent Chen reported. Robert Chen will receive enough money to pay for his surgery and ongoing medical care. Jennifer Walsh will get the child support payments Marcus stole, plus interest and penalties. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the federal building, Marcus himself, transported from the detention center where he'd been held since his arrest. His appearance was shocking. The confident attorney who'd once commanded respect in every courtroom was now a broken man in an orange jumpsuit, his expensive suits replaced by prison clothing, his arrogant demeanor replaced by desperate pleading. "Sophia," he said when Agent Chen allowed us a brief supervised meeting. "I need you to understand that I never meant for any of this to happen." I studied his face, looking for any sign of the man I'd once loved, but finding only the hollow shell of someone who'd finally been held accountable for his choices. The physical transformation was dramatic. He'd lost weight, his skin was pale from lack of sunlight, and his hands trembled with what I suspected was withdrawal from the prescription medications he'd been abusing. "What part didn't you mean to happen, Marcus?" I asked quietly. "Stealing from grieving families? Blackmailing vulnerable immigrants? Bribing police officers? Or hitting your wife when she discovered your crimes?" He flinched at each accusation, finally understanding that his attempts at rationalization and excuse-making would find no audience with me. The woman he'd tried to control through manipulation and violence had become the architect of his complete destruction. "I'm going to prison for the rest of my life," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Everything I worked for, everything I built, it's all gone. No, Marcus, I corrected him. Everything you stole is being returned to its rightful owners. Everything you built was constructed on a foundation of other people's suffering. You didn't lose something that belonged to you, you're finally being forced to give back what was never yours to begin with. The meeting lasted only 15 minutes, but it provided the closure I hadn't realized I needed. The man who'd once seemed so powerful, so confident, so untouchable, was revealed as fundamentally weak and cowardly when stripped of his ability to intimidate and manipulate others. As federal marshals led Marcus back to his holding cell, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this entire ordeal began: peace. Not satisfaction or revenge, but the quiet certainty that justice had been served and that other victims would be protected from experiencing what I'd endured. Saturday brought media coverage that transformed the case from a local corruption scandal into a national symbol of how individual courage could expose institutional failure. News programs featured interviews with victims who'd found their voices, legal experts who praised the thoroughness of the federal investigation, and advocacy groups who held up the case as a model for holding powerful criminals accountable. Former FBI agent brings down criminal husband and corruption network, read the headline in the Washington Post. Domestic violence victim becomes federal hero, proclaimed USA Today, but the coverage that meant the most to me was a story in the local newspaper featuring Maria Santos, Robert Chen, Jennifer Walsh, and dozens of other victims who'd finally received the justice they'd been denied for years. Mrs. Richardson saved our lives, Maria was quoted as saying. She showed us that even the most powerful people can't escape justice when someone has the courage to stand up to them. Sunday evening brought a final update from Agent Chen. Marcus's cooperation had resulted in 43 additional arrests, the seizure of over $15 million in criminal proceeds, and the identification of corruption networks in 7 states. The case would likely result in the largest civil rights prosecution in decades. He'll be sentenced in 3 months, Agent Chen informed me. Based on the cooperation he's provided and the severity of his crimes, the recommendation will be for 15 to 20 years in federal prison. I thought about the Friday night when this all began, when Marcus had raised his hand to me in anger and desperation. He'd wanted to silence my questions, to intimidate me into submission, to maintain control over a situation that was already beyond his ability to manage. Instead, that moment of violence had unleashed a reckoning that would reverberate through the legal system for years. Corrupt officials would face justice. Stolen money would be returned to victims. And most importantly, other women would see that domestic violence didn't have to be endured in silence. Marcus Richardson had raised his hand to me once, believing that physical intimidation would solve his problems. Tomorrow, he would learn that the consequences of that choice would define the rest of his life, and I would finally be free to build something better from the ashes of everything he'd tried to destroy. 3 months after my grand jury testimony, I stood in the federal courthouse wearing a navy blue suit that Elena had helped me choose, professional but not triumphant, dignified but not cold. Today was Marcus's sentencing hearing, the moment when years of investigation, testimony, and legal proceedings would culminate in a final judgment that would define the rest of his life. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Victims filled the first 6 rows, their faces reflecting a mixture of anticipation and hard-won justice. Behind them sat reporters, legal observers, and members of the public who'd followed the case, as it exposed the deepest corruption scandal in the city's history. Federal marshals lined the walls, their presence a reminder that this wasn't just another criminal sentencing, it was the conclusion of a case that had shaken the entire legal establishment. Judge Patricia Kellerman, flown in from another district to ensure impartiality, commanded the room with an authority that couldn't be purchased or influenced. She'd spent 40 years on the federal bench, building a reputation for fairness that had made her the perfect choice to preside over a case involving judicial corruption. Mr. Richardson, she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, you stand before this court having pleaded guilty to 37 federal charges including racketeering, money laundering, bribery, witness intimidation, and multiple counts of assault. Before I impose sentence, the court will hear from those your crimes have affected. The victim impact statements began with Maria Santos, whose teenage son's death had been exploited to fund Marcus's gambling addiction. She approached the podium with quiet dignity, her voice steady despite the tears that had begun to fall. Your Honor, Marcus Richardson didn't just steal money from my family. He stole our faith in justice, our belief that the system would protect us when we needed it most. My son died in a car accident, and instead of helping us heal, Mr. Richardson used our grief to make himself rich. She turned slightly toward Marcus, who sat hunched at the defense table, unable to meet her eyes. For 2 years, I lived in fear that he would have my family deported if I asked questions about the settlement. 2 years of silence while he spent money that should have honored my son's memory. Robertson followed, his disability evident as he slowly made his way to the podium with the aid of a walker. The construction worker whose settlement Marcus had stolen spoke in measured tones about the physical pain he'd endured while his stolen benefits funded luxury purchases. "I needed surgery that could have given me back my mobility," he said, gripping the podium for support. "Instead, I've spent 3 years in chronic pain because this man decided his gambling debts were more important than my ability to walk without assistance." One by one, 17 victims testified about the human cost of Marcus's crimes. Jennifer Walsh spoke about her children going to bed hungry while Marcus deliberately delayed their child support case. Patricia Gonzalez described the terror of being blackmailed with fabricated immigration documents. David Kim recounted how Marcus had stolen his elderly parents' life savings while threatening to have them declared mentally incompetent. Each testimony built a devastating portrait of systematic, predatory behavior that went far beyond financial crimes. Marcus hadn't just stolen money, he'd weaponized the legal system against the most vulnerable people in society, using their desperation and fear to maintain control while he pillaged their resources. But the most powerful statement came from Margaret Blackstone, whose 15 years of documenting her husband's crimes had provided crucial evidence for the prosecution. She stood at the podium with the bearing of someone who'd finally found her voice after decades of enforced silence. "Your Honor, I want this court to understand that domestic violence doesn't always leave visible bruises," she said, her eyes finding mine across the courtroom. "For 30 years, my husband controlled me through psychological intimidation, financial manipulation, and threats of institutional retaliation. I watched him destroy other families while I remained silent. Out of fear." She paused, gathering strength before continuing. "Mrs. Richardson showed me that courage is contagious. When she refused to be silenced by violence, when she chose justice over safety, she gave me permission to find my own voice. Her bravery didn't just expose Marcus Richardson's crimes, it liberated everyone who'd been trapped by this criminal enterprise." The morning break brought unexpected news that would reshape the entire proceedings. Agent Chen approached me in the hallway outside the courtroom, her expression grave. "We've received word from the Bureau of Prisons," she said quietly. "Marcus has been placed in protective custody. His cooperation against corrupt police officers has made him a target, and there have been credible threats against his life." The irony was stark. The man who'd spent years terrorizing others was now living in fear himself. Marcus's decision to provide testimony against corrupt law enforcement had painted a target on his back that would follow him throughout his incarceration. "How does this affect his sentence?" I asked, though I suspected the answer wouldn't change the fundamental calculation of justice. "It doesn't," Agent Chen replied. "His cooperation was valuable, but it can't erase the magnitude of what he did to his victims. Judge Kellerman isn't known for reducing sentences based on post-conviction security concerns." When court resumed, it was time for Marcus's own statement, his final opportunity to address the court before learning his fate. He rose slowly from the defense table, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the expensive suits he'd once worn with such confidence. "Your Honor," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I want to apologize to everyone I've hurt through my actions. I know that words can't undo the damage I've caused, can't restore the money I've stolen, can't eliminate the fear I've created in so many lives." He turned toward the victims section, though his eyes couldn't quite meet their gazes. "I told myself that I was just borrowing money, that I would pay everything back when my luck changed. I convinced myself that the threats and intimidation were necessary to protect my family's future. I was wrong about everything." For a moment, I saw a glimpse of the man I'd once thought I'd married, someone capable of acknowledging wrongdoing and accepting responsibility. But the moment passed when he continued. "I ask this court to consider that my cooperation has helped bring dozens of corrupt officials to justice. I've provided information that will protect future victims and help reform a system that allowed these crimes to occur. I believe I can still contribute to society if given the opportunity." The plea for leniency rang hollow after hours of victim testimony. Marcus was still trying to negotiate, still attempting to frame his cooperation as altruism rather than the desperate self-preservation it actually represented. Judge Kellerman's response was swift and unforgiving. "Mr. Richardson, your cooperation with federal investigators, while valuable, was motivated entirely by self-interest. You provided information only after your crimes were exposed, only after your victims had found the courage to seek justice despite your attempts to silence them." She consulted her notes before continuing. "The court has reviewed the pre-sentence investigation, the victim impact statements, and the extensive evidence of your criminal enterprise. The scope of your crimes is staggering, not just in terms of financial loss, but in terms of human suffering deliberately inflicted on vulnerable people. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Kellerman prepared to impose sentence. Even the reporters stopped taking notes, sensing that this moment would define how the justice system responded to institutional corruption. Mr. Richardson, you have pleaded guilty to operating a criminal enterprise that systematically exploited vulnerable people for personal gain. You used your position as an attorney, a profession built on trust and advocacy, to prey upon those who needed protection most. She paused, her eyes finding each victim in the courtroom before returning to Marcus. You blackmailed immigrants with fake deportation threats. You stole from grieving families while they mourned their loved ones. You delayed justice for children who needed support while you collected fees for unnecessary legal work. The judge's voice grew harder as she continued. Perhaps most significantly, you used violence and intimidation to maintain control over your victims, including your own wife when she discovered your crimes. Domestic violence is not a momentary lapse in judgment, it is a deliberate choice. To use physical force to maintain power over another person. Marcus's attorney had advised him to remain standing, but his legs seemed to give way as the weight of the judge's words settled over him. He gripped the defense table for support, finally understanding that no amount of cooperation or apologetic rhetoric would change what was about to happen. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison, Judge Kellerman announced, her words reverberating through the packed courtroom. This sentence reflects not only the severity of your crimes but the need to deter others who might believe that wealth and professional status place them above the law. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Victims embraced each other, tears flowing freely as years of suppressed hope finally found expression. Reporters rushed from the courtroom to file their stories. Federal agents nodded with satisfaction at seeing justice delivered so completely, but Marcus himself simply collapsed into his chair, the reality of spending the next quarter-century in federal prison finally penetrating his consciousness. The man who'd once commanded respect in every courtroom would now be just another number in the federal prison system. Judge Kellerman wasn't finished. Mr. Richardson, you will also pay restitution in the amount of $4.7 million to your victims, forfeit all assets obtained through criminal activity, and serve 3 years of supervised release following your incarceration. She looked directly at him for the first time during the proceedings. Perhaps most importantly, you are permanently disbarred from practicing law in any jurisdiction. You will never again have the opportunity to exploit the trust that clients place in their attorneys. As federal marshals moved to escort Marcus from the courtroom, he turned toward me one final time. Our eyes met across the distance that had grown between us since that Friday night when he'd raised his hand in violence and desperation. I saw no anger in his expression, no defiance or resentment. Instead, I saw something that looked almost like gratitude, as if some part of him understood that facing consequences for his actions was the only path toward whatever redemption might be possible. The courtroom slowly emptied, victims gathering to share their relief and plan for futures that were finally free from Marcus's shadow. Reporters interviewed prosecutors about the broader implications of the case. Legal observers discussed how the investigation had exposed institutional failures that would require years of reform to address. Agent Chen found me in the hallway as the crowd dispersed. It's over, she said simply. Marcus Richardson will spend the next 25 years in federal prison, and his criminal enterprise has been completely dismantled. I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of emotions that I couldn't quite untangle. Relief, certainly. Satisfaction at seeing justice delivered so thoroughly. But also sadness for the man I'd once loved, who'd chosen a path that led inevitably to this moment of complete destruction. What happens now? I asked, thinking about the victims who would still need support, the reforms that would need to be implemented, the work of rebuilding trust in institutions that had been so thoroughly corrupted. Now the real work begins, Agent Chen replied. The Federal Monitor will oversee reforms in the police department. The State Bar Association will implement new oversight procedures. The Victim Compensation Fund will continue operating until everyone receives full restitution. As I walked toward the courthouse exit, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 months ago, I'd been a graphic designer living in what I thought was a happy marriage, unaware that my husband was systematically destroying other people's lives for personal gain. The transformation hadn't been easy. Testifying against Marcus had required reliving traumatic experiences while facing constant threats from his criminal associates. Living under federal protection had meant giving up privacy and independence while the investigation proceeded. Watching someone I'd once loved face the complete destruction of everything he'd built had been emotionally devastating even when it was entirely justified, but standing outside the federal courthouse on a crisp autumn afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine hope for the future. Marcus's crimes had been exposed and punished. His victims had received justice and compensation. The institutional corruption he'd exploited had been rooted out and would face ongoing oversight. Most importantly, other women who faced domestic violence would see that even the most powerful abusers could be held accountable when victims found the courage to demand justice. The case had become a symbol of how individual bravery could expose systemic failures and create lasting change. Elena was waiting for me at the courthouse steps, ready to drive me home to the apartment we'd found together, a modest place that felt luxurious in its simplicity and safety. Tomorrow, I would begin rebuilding my life without the shadow of Marcus's crimes hanging over everything, but tonight, I would simply rest in the knowledge that justice had been served, that victims had been heard, and that the choice Marcus made to raise his hand in violence had ultimately led to consequences he could never have imagined. The reckoning was complete. But the work of healing was just beginning. 1 year after Marcus's sentencing, I stood in the conference room of the newly established Richardson Foundation for Legal Ethics, watching as our board of directors reviewed applications from domestic violence survivors seeking funding to attend law school. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Marcus's stolen millions, once used to fuel gambling addictions and luxury purchases, were now providing scholarships for women who wanted to fight for justice. 37 applications this quarter, reported Dr. Sarah Kim, who'd left her criminal defense practice to become the foundation's executive director. Each one represents someone who refused to let trauma define their future. The transformation had been gradual but inexorable. After Marcus's conviction, the federal government had seized all of his assets: the house where he'd hit me, the luxury cars he'd bought with stolen funds, the offshore accounts where he'd hidden his crimes. Rather than simply returning the money to the Treasury, victim advocates had pushed for something more meaningful, a foundation that would turn instruments of oppression into tools of empowerment. I'd initially resisted the idea of having my name associated with anything connected to Marcus's crimes, but Elena had convinced me that refusing would be another form of letting him control my life. He stole their money, she'd argued. Now you can use it to make sure other women never face what you endured. The foundation's work extended far beyond scholarships. We funded legal clinics in underserved communities, provided training for law enforcement on recognizing financial abuse, and supported legislation requiring attorneys to undergo regular ethics training. Every program was designed to address the institutional failures that had allowed Marcus's crimes to continue for so long. The Stanford application is particularly impressive, Sarah continued, holding up a file. Lisa Hernandez, whose immigration case was sabotaged by Marcus's blackmail scheme. She's maintained a 4.0 GPA while working full-time to support her family and volunteering at a legal aid clinic. I remembered Lisa's victim impact statement, a young woman whose dreams of citizenship had been weaponized against her by a man who saw vulnerability as opportunity. Now she was studying for the LSAT while helping other immigrants navigate a legal system that had failed her so catastrophically. Approve it, I said without hesitation. And make sure she knows the foundation will provide additional support during law school if needed. The morning meeting concluded with updates from our various programs. The Domestic Violence Training Academy had graduated its 15th class of police officers, prosecutors, and social workers. The Financial Fraud Prevention Initiative had helped banks identify suspicious patterns that might indicate elder abuse or disability exploitation. The Legal Ethics Symposium was being adopted by law schools across the country, but perhaps the most satisfying development was the news from Agent Chen, who'd called earlier that morning with an update on the ongoing investigations. The corruption network Marcus had exposed continued to collapse, with 3 more judges facing federal charges and an entire police precinct being disbanded due to systemic misconduct. The cultural change is remarkable, Agent Chen had reported. Fear of exposure has made corruption too risky for most people to consider. Marcus's case became a cautionary tale that reshaped how power operates in the city. After the board meeting, I drove to the coffee shop where I'd been meeting with Margaret Blackstone every Tuesday for the past 6 months. Our friendship had been forged in the crucible of testimony and trauma, 2 women who discovered that speaking truth to power could be both terrifying and liberating. Margaret was already waiting at our usual table, reviewing architectural plans for the new victim services center the city was building with funds recovered from corrupt officials. She'd thrown herself into advocacy work with the passion of someone making up for lost time. The groundbreaking is next month, she said, spreading the blueprints across the small table. 24-hour crisis hotline, legal assistance, emergency housing, and trauma counseling all in one location. No victim will have to navigate multiple agencies just to get help. I studied the plans, noting how every detail had been designed with survivor needs in mind. Private entrances to protect confidentiality. Child care facilities so parents could attend appointments. Meeting rooms equipped with video conferencing for victims who couldn't travel safely. Thomas would hate this, Margaret said with grim satisfaction. All these resources for people he considered disposable obstacles to profit. Thomas Blackstone was serving 18 years in federal prison, his law firm dissolved, his assets seized to provide victim restitution. The man who'd once wielded enormous influence from behind the scenes was now just another inmate in the federal system, his power reduced to whatever he could trade for protection from other prisoners. "How are you doing with the divorce proceedings?" I asked, knowing that untangling 30 years of marriage to a criminal conspirator was proving complex. "Finally free," Margaret replied with a smile that transformed her entire face. "The decree was finalized yesterday. I'm officially Margaret Chen now. I took back my maiden name along with my independence." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Maria Santos, who'd become a regular fixture in our informal support group. She was carrying law books, studying for her paralegal certification with the same determination she'd shown in pursuing justice for her son. "I wanted to thank you both again," Maria said, settling into the chair beside us. "The scholarship program is making it possible for me to build a career helping other families who've lost children." Maria's transformation had been remarkable to witness. The grieving mother who'd been terrorized into silence had become a fierce advocate for victims' rights, testifying before Congress about the need for stronger protections against predatory legal practices. "You did the work," I replied. "We just provided the opportunity." "No," Maria said firmly. "You provided the example. When I saw you refuse to be silenced by violence, when I watched you turn evidence into justice, you showed me that victims don't have to stay victims forever." The afternoon brought a phone call I'd been expecting but dreading. Marcus's prison counselor was requesting permission for him to contact me, not for forgiveness or reconciliation, but as part of his therapy program focusing on taking responsibility for his actions. "He's been asking to write a letter acknowledging the harm he caused," the counselor explained. "The therapeutic value isn't in your response, but in his process of confronting his crimes without expecting anything in return." I'd refused similar requests multiple times over the past year, but something in the counselor's description made me reconsider. Marcus wasn't seeking my forgiveness or trying to manipulate me into helping with his appeals. He simply wanted to acknowledge what he'd done and accept responsibility for the consequences. "One letter," I agreed. "But I reserve the right not to respond." The letter arrived 2 days later, written in Marcus's familiar handwriting but lacking the confidence that had once characterized his communications. It was 3 pages of detailed acknowledgement of his crimes, acceptance of responsibility for the harm he'd caused, and recognition that his victims deserved justice regardless of the cost to him. "I know that saying I'm sorry doesn't undo the damage I caused," he wrote. "I know that my cooperation with investigators was motivated by self-preservation rather than genuine remorse. I know that you have every right to hate me for what I put you and so many others through." The letter continued with specific acknowledgments of how his crimes had affected individual victims, demonstrating that his time in prison had been spent reflecting on the human cost of his actions rather than simply feeling sorry for himself. "I hid you because I was afraid of losing control, afraid of facing consequences, afraid of being revealed as the fraud I'd become. That fear doesn't excuse the violence, but I need you to understand that it was never about you. It was about my own cowardice and desperation." The final paragraph was the most difficult to read. "I don't expect forgiveness, and I'm not asking for a response. I just wanted you to know that your courage in exposing my crimes probably saved other people from suffering what I put you through. Whatever good comes from this situation exists because you refused to be silenced by my violence." I read the letter 3 times before filing it away, neither responding nor discarding it. Marcus's words felt genuine, but they changed nothing about the fundamental facts of what he'd done or the justice of his punishment. Some betrayals were too complete for forgiveness, regardless of the sincerity of later remorse. The 1-year anniversary of Marcus's sentencing brought media attention I'd hoped to avoid. Reporters wanted to interview the woman who'd brought down a corruption network, producers pitched movie deals about my story, publishers offered book contracts to tell my side of the scandal. I declined them all, focusing instead on the foundation's work and my slowly rebuilding personal life. The graphic design business I'd restarted was thriving, thanks partly to clients who admired my courage and partly to skills I'd maintained despite years of Marcus's subtle undermining. Elena had been my constant companion through the healing process, helping me distinguish between legitimate caution and trauma-induced paranoia. With her support, I'd started dating again, carefully, slowly, with the wisdom that comes from understanding how charm can mask danger. "You're different now," she observed during one of our weekend walks through the park where we'd played as children. "Stronger, but also more careful." It's like you've learned to trust your instincts instead of doubting them." She was right. The woman who'd married Marcus Richardson had been eager to please, quick to apologize, willing to suppress her own judgment in favor of maintaining harmony. The woman who'd exposed his crimes had learned that some conflicts were worth having. That some truths were worth telling regardless of the cost. The second anniversary of Marcus's arrest brought news that closed a final chapter in the saga. Agent Chen called to inform me that Marcus had been attacked in federal prison by inmates connected to the corrupt police officers he'd helped convict. He'd survived but been transferred to a higher security facility where he'd spend the remainder of his sentence in protective custody. "Ironic justice," Agent Chen observed. "The man who terrorized others through violence is now living in fear of violence himself." I felt no satisfaction at the news, only sadness that cycles of violence continued. Even when formal justice had been served, Marcus would spend the next 23 years looking over his shoulder, wondering when his cooperation against corrupt officials might be repaid with prison violence, but the broader changes his case had catalyzed continued to expand. The police department had implemented new oversight procedures that made corruption significantly more difficult. The legal profession had adopted stricter ethics enforcement that protected vulnerable clients. The court system had created victim advocate positions that ensured no one would face the system alone again. Most importantly, the case had become a cultural touchstone for discussions about domestic violence, institutional corruption, and the courage required to seek justice when powerful people prefer silence. Law schools taught courses using Marcus's crimes as case studies. Police academies included modules on recognizing financial abuse. Victim advocates referenced my testimony when encouraging others to come forward. 5 years after Marcus raised his hand to me in our marble kitchen, I stood in the same federal courthouse where he'd been sentenced, this time as a witness in the trial of the last corrupt officer from his network. The courtroom was smaller, the media attention minimal, but the principle remained the same: those who abuse power must face consequences. During the lunch break, I encountered David Walsh, Marcus's former attorney, in the hallway outside the courtroom. He'd been disbarred for his role in the conspiracy but had avoided prison by cooperating with investigators. Now he worked as a paralegal, his legal career permanently destroyed by his association with Marcus's crimes. "Mrs. Richardson," he said quietly, "I wanted you to know that I've spent every day of the past 5 years regretting my involvement in Marcus's schemes. I should have reported him instead of helping him hide his crimes." "Yes," I replied simply. "You should have." There was nothing more to say. David's regret was genuine but irrelevant to the victims who'd suffered while he'd helped conceal their abusers' crimes. Some choices carried permanent consequences that no amount of remorse could erase. That evening, I returned to my apartment, the same modest space Elena and I had found after Marcus's arrest, which had become home in ways our expensive house never had. The walls were covered with thank you letters from scholarship recipients, photos from foundation events, and artwork from children whose mothers had escaped abusive relationships with our help. As I prepared for bed, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The frightened woman who discovered her husband's crimes had become an advocate for institutional reform. The victim of domestic violence had become a symbol of how individual courage could create systemic change. The wife who'd been silenced by a slap had found her voice and used it to protect others. The bruise Marcus had left on my cheek had faded within weeks, but its impact would last for generations. Every woman who received a scholarship to law school, every victim who found justice through reformed institutions, every police officer who chose integrity over corruption, they were all connected to that moment of violence that had revealed the true character of a man I'd thought I'd known. Marcus Richardson had raised his hand to me once, believing that physical intimidation would solve his problems and maintain his control. Instead, that moment of violence had unleashed forces that destroyed everything he'd built while creating something better from the ruins. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, forgotten by history except as a cautionary tale about the consequences of abusing power. His victims would heal and thrive, supported by institutions reformed in response to their suffering. The corruption he'd embodied would face ongoing vigilance from systems designed to prevent future abuse, and I would continue the work of transformation, turning instruments of oppression into tools of justice, ensuring that no one else would face alone what I'd endured in silence. The reckoning was complete. The healing would continue for as long as it took to build a world where violence never won and justice was never silenced. After all, some bruises fade quickly, but the strength they reveal can last forever. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.